Hello, this is Carl Ackerman, host of Journeys of the Mind, a proud component of ThinkTech Hawaii, run by that mensch Jay Fidel. Today, we are very lucky to have Mr. Andy Winfrey because we are going to discuss special education today in all its wonders and perhaps what Andy sees in the future. First of all, welcome, Andy.
Thank you. Thank you, Carl.
And so, my first question is, how do you think you got involved in special education? And I know that you grew up in California, but your special education was your teaching was mostly and administrating was mostly in New York.
I think it had to do with my mother. My mother was a social worker and instilled in me a lifelong, interest in helping people and being in a helping profession. Uh, and I think that is the grounding. I've been thinking about that since my mother's 90, almost turning 98. So, and we've been talking about her past. And then I have a brother who was in a serious car accident, had traumatic brain injury. And when I, at the end of high school, and watching him go through the recovery process and then getting into school and being in special ed really gave me it was an eye-opening thing to see how hard it is and how what a struggle that he had, the family had. Um, and that got me thinking. And then I finished college without really knowing what I wanted to do, and a friend said, "Why don't you volunteer at a school in Berkeley?" And I did, a special ed school down by the freeway, and I just loved it. And even though I worked in special ed with mostly emotionally disturbed population, and my brother is not emotionally disturbed, he's has a traumatic brain injury. It just that ability to help people and help and work in small groups with kids who really needed a lot of help, and that's sort of what got me into the field. And I loved it, and I did it for 40 years. So that's that's how I got into it.
Let me ask you a little bit about your background here in terms of getting into it and what you mentioned. I know, are a proud graduate of one of the best colleges in the country, the University of California at Berkeley. And by the way, we are broadcasting today from New York, and I am in Manhattan, and Andy is in Brooklyn, and I'm located near the Lincoln Center, and Andy is in a wonderful place, Brooklyn. So just to let our audience know that this is a complete New York City broadcast. But so, was there anything specifically in your college training or in your early youth? Because I know that you were raised Catholic, that also contributed to your interest in special education.
I took some classes at Berkeley in education, like more general classes that were like there was an environmental education class that worked on how to give like an ecological slant towards education. I really like that. But my idea was to go to law school and study and do environmental law. That was the sort of the goal, and that didn't work out, and that's good. And so then I sort of um, did a bunch of other things. Worked a lot of different places. Until I did this thing where I worked at this school, and then once I did that, I had to then redo all my education, and I had at that point, right about that point, I moved to New York. So then when I got to New York, I had to get into school, get a degree, get a license, and that started the process. Um, I think I don't my parents were just they were very wonderful, caring people that made me. I remember my mom like talking about how you have to treat people fairly and not judge people by what religions they were or what color they were. California, we lived in a suburban environment in California. It was, mostly white, but there were other people there, of other types, and when you don't know what other types are, you can be afraid and make bad judgments, and my mom really helped me in not doing that, and that helped me a lot in special education, because it is especially in New York, it's a racially, I don't know what the word, you know filled with a lot of different groups that you have to deal with.
Tell us about first, because I know you were administrator also, but what was it like? And if you could describe the situation when you were teaching special ed.
Well, teaching, I taught like very small classes, so there may be 6 kids in a class with a teacher and an assistant. And when you have that small a group, you really know every single kid, every single family, every single thing. And I love that. I love that you really had a chance to really make a difference in that child's life. Um, the kids were difficult. When I was teaching, it was really, I sort of I related it to sort of like being like a comedian on stage, where you were doing a show, and the kids were your audience, and they were, if you weren't doing well, they would tell you. If you were teaching them something that they didn't want or they didn't feel they needed, and so you had to balance that, and put on a show, put on a presentation of what you wanted them to learn. And over time with special ed, they get to know, when you get pushed to the edge, when a kid is really um, confrontational, or what, they see how you act, and so you have to really, you have to have a lot of patience and a lot of persistence.
Often, when you think about teachers, you think of them being on stage and talking a lot, but it sounds to me like in your job, you had to do a lot of very careful listening. And if you could just describe that experience when you were listening to the kids, and in addition, what type of factors were special in these kids? I mean, where did they get that title, special education? Why were they special? In what sense?
Well, they were special in their learning styles were not followed the norms, and so they tended to have learning styles and learning abilities that were very different, and a lot of them then started to fall behind. And then you had their once they fall behind, then they're labeled, and then they're put into special ed. And so you had to really, try to teach them that it's okay to take extra time to learn, to learn in a different way. It was hard, because some of the kids were, they were really struggling. um, uh, so you had to really, you had to listen to what they needed. And the parents were struggling usually. Kids who have problems really create a lot of stress in families. So you had to really listen to the parents, because they could easily become, just discouraged or disgruntled by something that happened. The kid would complain, and you had to just be able to listen and not take things personally. Um, and you learn over time, to how to do that in education. You have if you don't, you're not going to be in the field.
What kind of you mentioned emotional issues with the kids, but did some kids have physical issues where they were and placed into your classes at special education?
There were some that had some, but not, but they weren't severe. They were more, things that might just, cause a little bit of difficulty or a little bit of adaptation. Um, most of my career, I was at a school where the kids were severely emotionally disturbed, and they were high school age kids, 13 to 21, and they all had been placed in psychiatric hospitals due to serious emotional problems. And then once they were released to our program, which was a residential site, and the kids were very aggressive, and very had a lot of problems. And they were also had developmental delays. So it was a dual diagnosis that is sort of it's an unusual small subset of special ed. And those kids, you really they had they had almost every problem that you can think of, and you had to just never give up. You had to, like, a kid might do something 99 times, and you maybe, but the 100th time, maybe then he learned. And you're trying to teach them how social skills was very important because they were really poor at their social skills, and so we were always trying to teach them how to act. A lot of the kids had come from very, very poor families with very, you know, not a lot of teaching and learning when they were little, and they didn't know how to answer the phone, or do some very simple things that were, that, everyone knows how to do that. No, they didn't know how to do that, and we were always having to teach them that because we realized that they didn't know how to do it. How do you play checkers in a game and not, get into a fight over it? Learning rules, learning how to take turns, things like that were very, very important.
Were these kids, because you mentioned they're high school age kids, did they get a diploma after they finished classes with you, or?
They would get No, they would not get a diploma. They wouldn't get The most they would get would be an IEP certificate, which means that they just completed their IEP goals. We made that into a graduation for the kids who did finish, but it's not really it's not a diploma that can be then used in for work or anything like that. And so we were always trying the kids who were at higher levels and were able to academically do well. We would try to get them back into the public schools because this was a non-public school, which is in New York. It's These are not non-public schools, or schools that service public school children, but they're run by private agencies. So our agency was not a public agency, and so it wasn't a public school. So we were always trying to get the kids back into public school because that's where their peers are. You want them to be with their peers. It was some We got a few kids back, but the public schools tended to not want the kids back because of problems, behavioral problems, learning problems, emotional problems.
How did you feel about that? I mean, the kids not being able to go back into, because of course you need a high school diploma to get almost any kind of job.
Elm City. Yeah. Yes, that was a really discouraging thing because they were kids who have been forgotten. They were not cared for by, the society here in New York. And so we were trying to get them into a place where they you know, could function. And that tended to be like low paying jobs. Uh, but, if a kid could work, that would be a good sign for us that they, because they would be motivated by the money they could make, and that would give them a sense of accomplishment, which a lot of them had very poor, you know, visions of themselves. Um, so, uh, it was very hard to get to move kids forward, and not all the kids, some of them did not make it. They weren't able to, and then they were into the world of homelessness and you know and mental health, the mental health world of New York, which is very large and very not good.
So did this take a toll on your teachers? I mean, I mean, you were someone who was very principled and had this background that encouraged you to stick with it, but was there a lot of turnover in your agencies and that you experienced? Because it seemed to me that would be watching this year after year would get pretty discouraging.
There was definitely some turnover, especially the teachers. The teacher assistants were very important because you really needed a good teacher assistant to help manage the classroom. And a lot of them did not turn over. They stayed. They liked the job. But the teachers did turn over. I mean, it the way the salaries are set in New York. a teacher like this who was teaching the hardest kids possible would get almost the lowest salary in the range of salaries in New York State. Much less than public schools. And then, so that was discouraging. I mean, the kids were, they weren't really, taken care of, by the parents or by society.
In that respect, is there something that you thought about in terms of the future that could be done, certain reforms that would help? And also, linked to this question is, I understand from the current president-elect, President Donald Trump, that they're trying to or not hurt, but destroy the education department. I mean, to wipe it out. Uh, will that have any effect on what you are doing? Um, uh, sort of in a broader, um, a general perspective about education in America.
Well, I think it has to affect everyone in education, but I mean the big push I assume will be the real push for charter schools, which will be taking resources away from the public schools. I assume all over the country. I mean, New York has a lot of charter schools, but they also have some really strong public schools. But it's gonna definitely hurt that, and it won't come with more money. It won't come with higher salaries. Um, him, demolishing or whatever he's going to do to the education department. I mean, they've already said they want to, end it, and throw it to the states. New York at least is a little better suited for that than some of the other states, but it still will be. I see it as being not a good thing for public education.
In New York, let me just ask you this question because many of our viewers are maybe from Hawaii, but across the nation. Um, does New York have a statewide system, or is it like California with districts controlling things?
It's the same as I would assume as California. There's a state education department, and they handle licensing and certain curriculum, requirements, and then the districts carry those out. And New York City is the largest school district in the country. I think it's 900,000 students in the New York City school district, and New York City has a lot of really bad schools, but they also have some really great schools. My daughter went through New York City public schools, and they were just wonderful. Very creative, very progressive, very rigorous, and it was a really a great thing. But it's hard to get into these schools. It's the high school that she went to in New York, which is right near where you're staying, Carl. It's harder to get into than Harvard, in terms of percentage of people who get in who apply. So, it's like the areas that have that kind of resources they'll make the schools better, but it's not for everyone. That's what they, it could be for everyone, but that takes money and resources and willpower. And I don't think we have that. I mean, our country is, looking down a different road right now.
Those great public schools. My great aunt Ruthie Cohen was a teacher, English teacher at Stuyvesant, and you had to take a test to get into Stuyvesant also. And so it was kind of it was interesting because when I talked to her, it sounded like a private school to me. And as you well know, I spent most of my career at a great private school, K through 12 in Hawaii, called Punahou, which claim to fame is that former President Barack Obama went to the school. But anyway, back to you. Um, so you also spent a considerable amount of time as an administrator for in the special needs framework. And so what was that like? Because that's sort of you're getting sort of a higher level view of what was going on in the school. So what was that like for you?
I really liked it. It was able to, trying to develop programs that would help the kids. We did all sorts of different um, curriculums that were not traditional because the kids weren't functioning at that level. I mean, in New York State, a 17-year-old has to take chemistry, and the 17-year-old is reading at a first grade level, chemistry is not going to be something that they're going to be able to do. So then how do you adapt science into for someone who's that age, and that level of functioning? And that was an administrator, that was the administration, that was our job, adapting things, adapting uh, we did a whole module program where we taught modules like social skills and activities of daily living, where we tried to make it more sort of interesting and fun, where the kids can learn some of the basic skills. And just having that ability to make programming and see it work for some, not for all, but work for some, was really great. And I worked at the school for a long time, and it's very rewarding. In special ed, you have to be rewarded by sometimes some small positive things. A kid just one time says something, changes how they think, and you have to really take that in and enjoy it. So I like that. A lot of the groups that I was involved with, as other schools of other non-public schools, there was an organization that we met together and talked about all the problems that these kind of schools had. That was hard because there were so many problems. It's all these schools trying to, fight for money, for resources, for teachers. We're competing over the same teachers almost. So that was hard. And I, it's like, it's how to think positively of it. It can be hard, but you have to do it. Otherwise, you won't work. It won't last. You know,
So,
Pretty positive. So
tell me about, if you can remember, I mean, that, this is difficult because I know you're retired now, but um, were there certain programs that you were very proud of, especially that you helped design, or programs that you implemented? And if so, what were they?
well, like we did this module program, and we did modules that were more. They weren't academic per se, but they were more functional. But then we also decided that the kids were, like I had said, that the kids were really bad at playing games. They would just get into fights and argue. And so we did a leisure module 2 afternoons a week, and the kids could sign up for the leisure modules. And and during those leisure modules, we taught them, how to take turns. One of the modules was, game playing, playing board games, which a lot of the kids didn't know how to do and never done it. So then you're teaching them how to play, how to take turns. We did bicycle riding, we did basketball, swimming, bowling, and the kids really liked it. And we had the problems were much reduced when we had these kind of modules. And that was a great module, and that really helped the kids, give them something that they enjoyed, because kids who live at a residential program can have a feeling pretty bad about their lives. So you're trying to give them things that they can take with them going forward. And teaching a skill to a kid that they can take on the rest of their life is really important. That was good. Our work program was, we did a work program in the summers where the kids worked full time, for not full time, but like 24 hours a week, and got paid. But then during the year, we also did a work program where we were trying to teach work skills. And that would be, besides the work skills, we would teach, interviewing skills, writing resumes, things like that. And that helped a lot of the kids. A lot of the kids really liked that, and they used it as they moved on.
That's particularly interesting. So, did you have arrangements with certain industries, or like a McDonald's, or anything like that in
McDonald's.
that program?
Kids can't work at McDonald's. Special ed kids, because they're people that they're yelling at the staff all the time. It's very high pace. Our kids never did well. They all wanted to work there. No, we worked at the Queen's Library. We worked at the Queen's College Library. We worked at the local YMCA. We worked in the parks with the Parks Department. Uh, what were some of the other jobs? We had a connection at a nursing home, at a CVS. Like, one of the CVSs was willing to have our kids work there. So you had, and that was part of administration. You had to go out and try to get someone to to do it. Sometimes the teachers would say, this one teacher came in and says, "Oh, I take, I go to this one uh, veterinarian or a pet place, and she liked it, and the kids, a bunch of kids went there and they loved working. When I would go to visit and sort of check on the work, it was the smell was just terrible because it was, all these animals in the basement of a veterinary place. To me, it was terrible, but the kids loved it because they could play with the cats and dogs and learn. So yeah, we found a lot of jobs, and they changed over because if a kid had a problem and there was an incident, a lot of times they would just say, "We don't want you back."
That's particularly interesting because I know now in education across the country, whether it's private or public, they have dogs that come into the schools, and the dogs help calm down the kids, and the kids pat the dogs, and they, interact with the dogs, and the kids
Very,
become very mellow.
yes, a lot of kids. It really helps them. Dogs are very good companions.
So, on two levels, I want you to answer this question, and that is, does this mean that special ed teachers have to be able to be masters of several different fields when you're teaching these kids? I mean, some of it's, as you mentioned, is pretty elementary elementary, social interaction skills. But
Right.
do you have to have like a broad base in mathematics and in history and in English and things like that if you become a special ed teacher?
Yeah, especially in the elementary ages, you do tend to have to a lot of special ed. It's all your self-contained class would you'd have to teach all subjects. You had to have some knowledge and some ability to do that. When it got into the older classes, sometimes you could pair two or three classes together. So maybe one teacher would teach math and one would teach reading and one would teach science, or you can mix it up according to the teacher's strengths and stuff. But you had to be more open and more available to. It's not you just teach history, for five classes a day. You had to be able to do a much wider range, which was hard. It works better in elementary as it does in high school because the content just becomes much more complicated. More,
Here's the other part of the question. And the second part of this is, so how did you find these Renaissance people when you were hiring them for your school?
you use all the, I mean, back then when I was doing it a lot, was the New York Times had a education page in the opinion section, and if you were looking for a job in teaching, that's where you'd go. So we would use that as a way, and then I would try to talk people. People. I know people who are teachers. Teachers who are a lot. There's always a bunch of teachers who worked in the Board of Ed, the New York City Board of Ed, and who were frustrated by it. And you'd say like, oh well, maybe you want to, and we got a couple that came that switched because they wanted to have a little more autonomy and more support, because a lot of the schools, the teachers would say that they don't get a lot of support. And in small schools, I mean, when I was an administrator, I was in every class every day. I knew every kid in the school. I mean, we only had 60 kids, but so you're supporting the teachers all the time, and you see if a teacher's having trouble, how they, what they need to get past that or learn from, how to deal with the kids. The kids were very difficult, so you had to really be, you had to be there because all the time. They had to feel that you were there all the time.
I began by asking you what prepared you for special ed. So now I'm going to ask you sort of a sociological question about you. This will be my last question for you. Um, about what was it about your family? Because I know you're married and have a daughter, and your situation at home that allowed you to stay in such a challenging field for so long. Because, it's not like you can just shut yourself off, your personality off once you leave the school, or maybe you did. But, what was it about your social environment in New York City that allowed you to be in special education, which obviously was very challenging for so many
Right.
kids?
I think that we like the house that we live in, a house on a block, a very nice block in Brooklyn, and I know a lot of people on the block. We have a block association. We have block parties. We have block dinners. Um, I've been on the board. Like it takes a village. You have to have support around you, and I think that's important. And then, and I'm very patient. Now, if you ask my wife and my daughter, they might say I'm not as patient with them because during work, you're getting paid, you have to be patient, you know, and that was just part of it. It wasn't that hard for me to do it at work. It was harder for me to be patient at home. Um, and you have to have outlets, and definitely being physically active is good if you can do that. I've always been fairly physically active, and have outlets that you can, whether it's friends or, hopefully they're not, I mean, every once in a while to go, go out after work for drinks on a Friday afternoon is okay. You can't do it all the time, but every once in a while to just to and doing that with the staff, you were engendering like a family feeling that we were a family. I mean, 60 kids, we had 35 staff for the school. So, we could go all out, we could go out somewhere together, that really helped because then people felt that they were, part of something. And I feel, I feel part of something here at my home and my, and my block. Um, I think that, I mean, that, when I started teaching, I would come home after work and I'd want to tell stories about the kids, not personally stories, but just how some of the funny things they did or said, and everyone would laugh and go, "Oh, that's funny." And then as time goes by, you just stop doing that because no, people didn't want to hear it, and you don't want to. You didn't want it. You wanted more separation between work and home, and work and not work.
We have been extraordinarily lucky today to have the family man who grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area with his grandfather having a house in San Francisco and who progressed through his education into the special ed programs of New York City. And what a pleasure it was to hear about special education from a real enthusiast and someone who knows it well. Well, very grateful to you, Andy Winfrey. And as we say in Hawaii, even though I'm in New York right now, hui ho.
Thank you, Carl. Been very nice.